Man, you can be seated. Good morning. Welcome to those of you that are joining us for the first time. Welcome to those of you who are watching online. I see you too. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get right into the Word of God today. If you're joining us for the first time, we are continuing a series that we started last week, and we're calling it Crazy Love Stories. And what we're doing is we're looking at some of the craziest love stories in the whole Bible, and we're pulling out some relationship principles that really apply to all of us. So whether you're dating, whether you're single, whether you're married, whether you hope to be married someday or not, there's some really great principles in here that apply to all of us. And one quick disclaimer before I jump in case you missed last week, a lot of times when you do a topic like this in the church, it's really easy for somebody to hear something that the pastor says and go like, oh shoot, that was right directed at me. It's not. This is a topic that's so broad and applies to everybody, okay? So it doesn't mean that I know your personal business. It doesn't mean your spouse called me before this message and said, hey, can you include this? It just means that this applies to everybody. It's a broad sweep. And so if you hear something that's right to you, maybe that's God speaking to you. I don't know. So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 24 today. And it says this. I'll fill in the background as I go through it because we're in the middle of a very crazy story here. It says, Abraham was very old. He was 140 to be exact. And the Lord had blessed him in every way. You know, when I read that statement, I can't help but stop and think, I want that to be a statement that's true of my life, especially toward the end, that the Lord has blessed me in every way. You know, I like how it says that about Abraham. It doesn't say that he was perfect in every way. It doesn't say that his story was perfect in every way or his circumstances were perfect in every way, but it does say that he was blessed in every way. And we've been talking in this series about how there's no such thing as a perfect marriage. There's no such thing as a perfect relationship. There's no such thing as a perfect parenting relationship. Those don't actually exist, and anybody that thinks they have a perfect relationship is probably one of the first ones that's going to realize, oh shoot, I messed up. But you can have a blessed marriage. You can have a blessed relationship. You can have a blessed parenting relationship with those rascals. It doesn't say his life was easy in every way because, you know, I don't know if you know the story of Abraham, but his life contained a lot of mistakes, some failures, a lot of uncertainty. He had basically set out from his homeland where he grew up, where he was comfortable, and he had been sent on this mission to this place that was not yet called this, but it was going to become known as the Promised Land. And he was set out, and he was sent out in Genesis 12, and just crazy stuff happened in his life. And yet he's called the father of our faith. He's called the one that had become the father of many nations. And at the end of it all, with all the hardship that he went through, it says he was blessed in every way. And so I just want you to remember that even when you're going through something tumultuous, even when you're walking through a really painful season involving your relationships that are closest to you in your life, God has a promise, and he always fulfills his promise. He has a plan, and he always fulfills his plan. And he also is the master, we'll get to this in a minute, at taking things that are even broken and shattered and restoring them into something that was even more beautiful than it was before it broke. So some of you need to grab onto that hope because the hope is found in Jesus Christ. Okay, verse 2, let's continue. He said, Abraham, to the senior servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, this guy's name was Eliezer. Okay, he's going to be kind of the star of this story. He said to him, put your hand under my thigh. Wow. Verse 3, the servant filed a harassment charge. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to stop here because, like, how many times have you read that, some of you, and you just read it like it's normal? That is not normal. Like, so you need to look at that and say, what is going on here? And so I'm going to explain the context to you so that you don't just think it's a weird thing. That, back in that culture, in that time of history, was like the equivalent of making an agreement by handshake. That's just what they did. It's weird to us today, get the hand sanitizer, whatever, but like, you know, that was what they were doing. And so the servant was swearing an oath to his master. He was making an agreement with him, and that's kind of just how they did it, okay? So let's move on. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I am living, but will go to my country where my own relatives are and get a wife for my son Isaac there. So what's happening here in Genesis 12, Abraham had set out, and he went to a place that was known as Canaan. Okay, and he traveled over 500 miles to get to the land of Canaan, and he's endured famine, and he's endured hardship, and he struggled to find water at times. He had to go to Egypt one time, which was 250-mile journey, and he's been through a lot on this long, hard journey. So now, at this point in the story, he's been in this place called Canaan for some years, and he remembers the promise God made to him when he sent him out that said, hey, Abraham, I'm going to make you the father of many nations, which means there has to be a lot of offspring from you. But he didn't have that yet. So now he's thinking about his son Isaac. He says, well, if God's going to fulfill that promise, that means that my son has to get married and start having children. And if you study it, at this time, his son is already 40 years old and he's still not married yet. And back then, it was pretty unheard of that you wouldn't be married by at least age 30. It was just a common in that culture, and he's 40 years old, so, most scholars tell us he's about 10 years late, and so Abraham's like, this has to happen. And I will pause there and say, because I think this applies to a lot of us who are wrestling through relationships, specifically even people that maybe are single and wanting that relationship to come along soon. You don't have to freak out whenever God's timing is not the same timing as you think it should be in your relationships. We have a culture that we live in right now, the world we live in, that is telling you that things should happen by a certain time, things should happen in a certain time, and they should happen in a certain way. And I'm wanting to share with you today that sometimes God's plan, in fact, more often than not, does not line up with the plan culture tells you you're supposed to have. God's timing typically does not line up with the timing that you think you're supposed to have or culture tells you you're supposed to have. And so, what's happening here, what you're going to see in this story as I walk you through it, is God kind of comes in and sets this marriage up in a really cool way. And I wonder how many of us try to set up our own marriages without putting God at the center of it at all, and then we wonder why certain things start happening or why it's not blessed. And so God's kind of, in a sense, arranging this marriage. And, having a daughter, I just want to go on the record of saying that I wouldn't really care if arranged marriages came back. I'm glad I got to choose mine, thank God, but I want to choose my daughters. I'm sure a lot of parents feel the same way. But anyway, we're going to see in this passage, and I think this will be really encouraging to all of us, how God sets up this marriage. And that's what I want for your life. Even if you're in a marriage today that God is not the center of necessarily, it's not over. Okay, I want you to know that that's where God has you now, and that can still happen for you in God's timing. Okay, and I pray that it does. And so we're about to see how God kind of works this thing out, and he kind of brings this relationship together. So the first thing Abraham says, let me back up. He says, I don't want you to find a wife for my son here where we are living now. I want you to go back home to our homeland and find a wife there. Why? Well, if you know what was happening there, this wasn't the promised land yet. So this was a place called Canaan, and in Canaan, it was full of people that worshiped false gods. They worshiped many gods that aren't even gods. He wanted the servant to go find a wife for his son 500 miles away in their homeland where everybody worshiped the God of the Bible, the one true living God. He didn't want the marriage to be started where he's marrying someone who worships all these false gods. He wanted the real God to be at the center of this marriage, since there was a promise God was going to fulfill, and it was supposed to be a God-honoring centered thing. And so that's why he's sending him on this big journey to find a wife that can be that for him. And so let's see how the servant responds. Verse 5, the servant asked him, what if, those of you that write in your Bibles, you might want to underline that. What if? What if? He says, what if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I then take your son back to the country you came from? And what we see here is the servant is already making a contingency plan. God has made a promise. They believed in God's promise. They trusted in God's promise. And the servant is now already making a plan B. I know that none of you do that, but back then, they didn't have the level of faith that you all have today. I realize these guys were very barbaric and archaic, and a long time ago, back in the day, they used to do that. You guys trust God all the time, right? But back then, they didn't when things got, they weren't as sophisticated as us. So, verse 6, make sure that you do not take my son back there, Abraham said. The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, to your offspring I will give this land. Listen to this part. He, God, will send his angel before you so that you can get a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there. Do you got it? In other words, if this matchmaker thing that I'm sending you out to do doesn't work out, then so be it. But as soon as the servant starts playing the what if game, which I know we've all played in our lives, like, I know God promises this, but what if he doesn't come through? I'm going to do it my way now. I know that God has a plan for me, even in my relationships, but what if it doesn't work out because I don't see it working out yet, so I'm going to take it into my own hands and not do it his way? I've heard this question a lot as a pastor, specifically from a lot of younger people who are wanting to get married someday. They'll say, yeah, Jarrod, what if I don't marry the right one? Like, that's a fear of theirs. What if I don't marry the right one? Like, is there only one out there for me, and how do I find that one? Because if God has that one for me, then I want to make sure I find that one, or it's not going to be good. And not only, guys, is that not really a biblical thing. I just want to throw that out there. But let's just play it out logically for a second, if you don't mind. If there's only one out there that you can marry, this one person that God has set aside for you, and that's just the one person, and then you end up marrying the wrong one, then that also means that one is marrying the wrong one, and the one that was supposed to marry them is marrying the wrong one, the one that was supposed to marry you is marrying the wrong one. And so now you've just caused generations of chaos, and you've effectively thrown off the entire romantic trajectory of the universe. So now, decades later, everyone on earth is going to be married to the wrong one because you messed up with your choice. You see how ridiculous that sounds? We need to get away from this language. And so the servant ends up saying, what if? What if she doesn't come back with me? What if this is a long journey, master. What if she doesn't come back with me when I find her? And I know some of you are wondering, I talked to a young person in the last 2 weeks. It's like, man, I feel like I'm never going to meet the right one. I'm getting older. This person's 20. Oh my gosh. Like, you have a lot of life ahead of you. You don't need to get ahead of yourself. And then, a lot of people, when they become parents, especially of teenagers or young adults, then, it becomes out of control because you don't have control anymore. And so you worry about your children as they go into relationships. And I like what Abraham says here, which is, hey, I don't see it happening yet, but God made me a promise. And God keeps his promises. Those of you that take notes, you might want to write this down. Your security is not found in another person. Your security is found in God's promise. Let me elaborate on that for a second. There's so many people out there as they enter relationships or enter marriage, and they think that, you know what, this person's going to complete me, right? That's what you hear in Hollywood. This person's going to complete me. Mark my words, there's no person on the face of this earth that can complete you. A dysfunctional human being cannot complete another dysfunctional human being. It's not a thing. There's one who can complete you, and that's Jesus Christ. And if you're in a marriage or relationship, you're parenting, whatever, there's no such thing as that relationship being perfect. There's no such thing as that relationship not going through struggle, going through pain, going through sacrifice, whatever you want to call it. And so really, it's not about finding the perfect person for you because that person doesn't exist. Really, it's about doing it God's way, and hopefully both of you are doing it God's way, and then you get to a place where it's not perfect, but it's blessed. That's what we're after in this series. A lot of people today are just wanting somebody to pop that question. I hope he proposes to me. I hope I had a guy recently tell me, I'm hoping she proposes to me. Like, what? We need to have a longer conversation. So, but I think some of the most important words that you can say in your life are really not, will you marry me? I think a more important way to say it is, God has promised me. God has promised me. I like what Abraham said. Abraham said, we're not leaving the place God has called us to. We're here in Canaan. This is going to become the promised land because God keeps his promises. We're not leaving this place. The promised land, in a way, represents the place God has called you to, your position in Christ, right? The land that God currently has you living in. And I want to humbly say something to the unmarried individuals in the room for a minute. And I mean this in love, but especially the younger people. You have so much life ahead of you. You think you're getting older. Those of us that are older are laughing. You're still young. There's still a lot of time left. You're going to make mistakes. during the critical years sometimes. And yes, God can redeem you and God can forgive you when you make mistakes and he can bring you back to that place of redemption that you're always meant to be. But here's something that was said to me when I was younger, and it was said to my wife, and I try to say it to young people as often as I can, and I want you to hear it from me today, and I'm saying this because I love you. Yes, God can take you from any broken place you end up with and restore it. But I'm so burdened to say to the young people that I would rather see us get to the point where we make those decisions earlier, so then we don't have to carry the scars later into life. There's decisions you can make as a really young person that you will carry for the rest of your life. And I wish more people following Jesus would try to make the decisions from an earlier age, because it would save you a lot of pain that some of us have been through. To say, you know what, I'm not leaving the land. I think we all need to say that. I'm not leaving the place God has called me to be. Even if it's not my timing, even if I don't see him answering the prayer the way I want him to answer it, I'm not going to leave the place that he's called me to. Okay, now I'm going to speak to the married people. Remember, I go back and forth. As married people, it's different. We need to make the decision today that no matter how hard it gets, no matter what comes our way, no matter how much pain is involved, even when we don't feel all tingly all the time, which, that's not every day once you're married. I just want to throw that out there. Even when we don't wake up to each other and roll over every morning and it's like it was at first. Even when you don't feel it every day, we're not leaving the land either. We're not leaving the covenant we've made. We're not leaving the place where God has us today. We're not stepping aside from our commitment because we've gone way too far to give up now. Abraham said in this story, hey, I'm 65 years old. I went through hell to get to this place that I'm at now, and I'm not about to forfeit all that God has promised me right now by taking my son out of the land of Canaan. We're not leaving this place. I'm sending you to find him a wife from the right place. That's what's going on here. And if I could be a little bold here, and I'm not saying this to specifically anyone in this room, I'm saying it to, I wish this could be said to all the men in our nation, actually. I don't know if you know the statistics in our country, but I wish that all the men in our nation would actually start making the decision to start leading their families. I wish the men in our nation would stop abandoning their sons and daughters because they have hormones or because they have this or they have that, but they don't have the guts to actually stay and be a dad. That would change everything. I wish some dads would say, no matter how hard it gets, no matter how hard the fight gets, I'm a man and I'm going to stay and fight and not walk away from what matters most. Okay, back to those of you who are not married. I used to be in your shoes, and it wasn't that long ago. So I remember what it was like. I want to let you know that. My wife and I have been married for 13 years. Shut up, I know how long it's been. I was trying to figure out how to say it best. And so I just love Abraham's trust in God. I love how he's walked with God through so much uncertainty and so much struggle at this point in his life that he's going to trust God with this one too, even though this one seems like a harder one. And so I think one of the hardest things for us to do when we're waiting for the right person, when we're parents and we want our child to end up with the right person, hoping our kids find the right one, marry the right one, I think one of the hardest things for us to do in this area of relationships is trust God. I think it's hard because his timing isn't always the timing we think it should be. And the way that he goes about restoring things isn't always the way that we wish he would. And although trusting our future to God is sometimes one of the hardest things that we can do in the area of relationships, it's also the only way. And it's the best way. You may as well trust God because you cannot be him. I think some people want to be him, but you would make a horrible God. And so would I. And so we'd be better off to trust God. And so Abraham refers back to the promise that God made to him. And I know some of you are waiting right now. You're waiting for someone to come along. You're waiting for that right person. You're waiting for marriage. You're waiting for your current marriage to be restored maybe or healed. And this is what I would say. Stop waiting for somebody to come and meet all of your needs, and instead start focusing on becoming a person who is noble and wrong. We'll get to that in a second. But this is meant to be an encouraging word for anybody that maybe is tempted to leave the land that God's called them to right now. Are you somebody who is often quick to, in the area of your relationships, jump outside of God's will? Or do it in ways that are not God's ways and then wonder why it's not blessed or wonder why it's not working out the way you thought it would? I may be lonely right now, but I know God keeps his promises. I may be struggling in this relationship right now, but I know that God has a plan. And I'm going to trust him even when there's struggle, and I'm going to trust him even when things seem difficult. And I think the reason that many of us struggle in the area of being confident and secure in our relationships, if I'm being honest, it's because we need to stop comparing our song to somebody else's soundbite. You've sung the whole song of your life. And then you see one soundbite from their song and you think, oh, I want that. Why don't I have that? But you haven't heard the whole song they've sung. You haven't heard every lyric. You haven't heard that they've actually been through verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, a very long 450-mile bridge, and then verse 4. You haven't heard the whole song. You're just hearing their soundbite of their marriage or their relationship saying, I want that. You haven't heard the whole song. Another way that you could say this is, don't compare your starting point to someone else's finish line. I think that we do that a lot. It's like we see this marriage and we want ours to look like that. And it's like, you're just starting though. You haven't seen the 10 years they've put in to get it there. You haven't seen the struggle they've gotten through to get it there. You haven't seen the hard times. You're only seeing this picture of it looking so good. That's like the finish line. You're starting. You don't get to start with that sometimes. Sometimes you have to go through the same struggle they went through in order to get it to be the beautiful thing that God always intended for it to be. Verse 9. So the servant put his hand, here we go, under the thigh of his master, Abraham, we'll get through it, and swore an oath to him concerning this matter. Verse 10. Then the servant left, taking with him 10 of his master's camels. This part matters. Why did he take 10 camels with him and all this other stuff? The reason is, if you study that culture back then, he was bringing to the parents of this woman that he would find what was called a dowry. And a lot of people misunderstand this concept of the dowry. They think, oh, the parents are greedy, or that was just such a dumb custom. It's like they were buying a wife, right? Like that's so negative sounding. But if you really study the culture, it was actually so much deeper than that. What a dowry actually was, if you look at the essence of it, it was you have to be willing to invest something of great value if you want to marry my child. And so if you're going to if my daughter's going to become your wife, you better bring something to the table that you're showing your level of commitment. Because if you're bringing an investment of that size to the table, then I know you're going to stick with this like you should. I know that this commitment's going to play out. You're invested. If I just let you take her for free 500 miles away, who knows what's going to happen, but you're invested. So you see, there was so much more of a deeper meaning to this. It reminds me of when I was young and impoverished, and I had to propose to Amy, and I couldn't afford the ring, so I literally saved for like 4 months straight, and then took every single penny out of that bank account, and I gave it to some doofus sales guy at the jewelry counter, and I got the ring, and I went and proposed. That's kind of what's happening here. He's taking this level of investment, like everything in there, and he's taking it as this investment for his future wife. And so it says he sets out with the camels, and he leaves, and he takes all kinds of good things from his master, and he set out for Aran Naharim and made his way to the town of Nahor. He had the camels kneel down near the well outside the town. It was toward evening, the time that the women go out to draw the water. I'm going to walk you through this part of the story in detail in a minute because we're going to get a lot out of this. But I want you to notice something here. In verse 10, he sets out, and if you read it and you pay attention to it, he's being very intentional in the way that he goes about this. I think that's the opposite of how most of us enter into relationships. I think we treat our relationships as this like haphazard, casual, not sacred thing sometimes. And the thing that's caused that is Hollywood, but that's not real life. I fell in love. Falling in love is not real life. That's Hollywood. I'm not saying you don't feel deep feelings of love. That's a good thing. But if you base a relationship or a marriage on that, when those aren't there every day, then you're in trouble. If you look at what the Bible actually says about love, it doesn't say that you fall in love. It doesn't say that you feel love. It describes love more like this. Love is patient. Love is kind. It doesn't boast. It doesn't envy. I could go down the list. It says love is a choice, not a feeling. Love is a commitment. Love is a sacrifice. Love is a heart of servanthood. There's a long list of ways this describes love, but it never describes it as a romantic feeling that you feel like we find in There is no serendipity. I fell into love. The definition of love is so much deeper and serious than that. And so I want you to see that here. He's setting out with this intention in his heart. And I like that because as you're about to see in this whole process that I'm going to walk you through here, there's a lot of practical stuff that's going to apply to all of you, okay? But I want you to see what the servant does. He takes these camels and he puts them near this well in verse 11, and then he goes out at the time that the women are going to come down to the well to draw the water. See, I think some people are waiting on God to send them this person. They're waiting on someone else to set them up with the right person, and that can work sometimes, okay? I'm not saying it doesn't, but this guy says, no, I'm going to take initiative. First of all, I'm going to go to where the women are, and I'm going to go at the time that they're going to show up. He's being purposeful about finding this wife for Isaac. And so you're about to see God lead this whole thing and kind of set this relationship up in a really cool way. But I want to point something out before I read the rest of the story. And maybe this will encourage those of you who are in a place of loneliness, or maybe you're in a season of transition when it comes to relationships. The journey that the servant took to go find Rebekkah was over 450 miles long. And I did the research on this. With an entourage of 10 camels, it would have taken a minimum of 21 days to travel this distance. And if you look at the region that they traveled to get to the homeland, it was a pretty dangerous area. Do you think there could have been bandits? Do you think they experienced some hardship on this 450-mile journey? Do you think there were days where they couldn't find water? Do you think there were days where they wondered if they were going to get through, where they were dry or parched or thirst quenched? Days without sleep? I think this was not an easy journey. This had to be one of the hardest 450-mile journeys ever to get to fulfill God's purpose here. But here's the thing I want to point out to you in spite of all that. We're reading right now today the longest chapter in the entire book of Genesis. It's 67 verses long. And not one verse in that entire chapter is dedicated to how hard that 450-mile journey was. Not one. It doesn't mention it, even though it had to be. And you have to ask the question, why is that? And I think the reason is because it wasn't even worth mentioning how hard the journey was in comparison to the promise that was fulfilled by the end of the chapter. And some of you need to hear that, because right now you're in the middle of the 450-mile journey. And it's hard, and there's struggle, and there's sacrifice, and it's difficult, and you can't see the promise being fulfilled yet. You can't see the blessed situation you're eventually going to end up in. You're just in the journey part. But what I'm telling you is, if you do it God's way, if you keep trusting in His promises, eventually you get to the other side of that journey, and the blessing and the fulfillment of His promise that comes at the end of that can be so great that now the journey, the hard journey you were on, is just a side note. It's not even worth mentioning in light of that. I think that's a powerful concept. I think that we all need to think about that a little more often. And so when you're going through a hard journey, especially when you're not married yet and you want to be, and you might think, well, I just don't see it happening. Remember, sometimes it's about patiently trusting the Lord and letting Him pull out the timing. And I just want to tell you, on the basis of God's word today, when you get to the other side of a hard journey, more often than not, you see God's faithfulness in a way where you immediately say the hard journey was worth it. And it can be a switch like that. In the New Testament, Paul said it too. He said, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. When he wrote that, he was enduring a lot of suffering, persecution, and he still wrote that. And he said, our present sufferings, not even worth comparing to the glory that we're going to see in the end. He said it in another spot. He said, our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. I try to remember those two verses every time I'm suffering, every time I'm going through painful, hard times. In comparison to what's coming at the end of this, they're light, they're momentary. It's a powerful verse, But you see that? Not one verse about how hard the journey was. If you want to tie this into the whole essence of Christianity, you might feel like you're in the middle of Good Friday, where it seems like it's only bad and it seems like evil has won and all good has been killed, like it's just been shattered. But I want to point out, Good Friday, the death of Jesus even lasted for 3 days. The resurrection wasn't the next second. There was a spot in between there. He's been risen now for 2,000 years, so we think of those 3 days as nothing, but there were 3 days after he was killed on the cross that people thought evil had won. But it's just a footnote now in the whole redemptive story of the gospel. And it can be that way in your life too. Because see, the story of Isaac and Rebekkah, it seems like such a big story as we walk through it, and I'm sure it did to them, but in light of everything and all of history, it's really just a small part of a much larger story that God is writing. Even just in the book of Genesis, it's a small part of a bigger story where God calls this one man out, and he says, you are the one I'm calling out, and I'm going to make you the father of many nations, and I'm going to send you to this land that it's going to seem impossible to win, and it's going to become what we call the promised land, flowing with milk and honey. And there's going to be so many times where you don't believe it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. This is a subplot in a much larger story. All right, verse 12. Let's watch how this whole thing plays out. This part's going to help parents, young people, everybody. Verse 12. Then he prayed. It's a good thing to do. When life's going a certain way, I always challenge people to ask the question, when's the last time I prayed about this? Sometimes it seems so casual and unimpacting, but it's not. I'll get to that in a second. And this is what he prayed. Lord, God of my master Abraham, make me successful today and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I am standing beside this spring, and the daughters of the town people are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a young woman, hey girl, let down your jar so that I can have a drink, and she responds, go ahead, drink, I'll water your camels too. May she be the one that you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. So he's telling God, if it works out this way, I'm going to know that this was the woman that I'm supposed to bring back as the wife. Let's talk about that for a minute. What do you do when you can't see God working in your situation right now? There's 3 things. I'm going to give them to you all at once. The first one we see here, you pray. I think in the church, in Christianity, I think this is rampant, where we don't pray sometimes until tragedy strikes. You know, I know so many people who don't even believe in Jesus, but the first time tragedy strikes, they start praying to him. I think we need to pray first, like before tragedy comes. I think we're in this weird place where as Christians, like a lot of us, you know, we think, well, I have to pray now because I'm in trouble. What if we prayed every day instead, before the trouble even comes? Would we be more prepared? I think that's a great starting point. So he prays, but then number 2, I want you to notice Eliezer positions himself. He positions himself, and both are important. I think that some people are so hyper-spiritual about that stuff. I hear this all the time. It's like, I'm just waiting on a wife. I'm just praying for God to send me a wife, like he's going to just put her in a FedEx box and ship her to your door, like without you doing anything. I think sometimes it takes a little positioning of yourself, some intention, like we're seeing in this story. I'm just waiting on God to send me the right man. And sometimes it's like, well, you're saying you want the right man, but you're not really doing a lot in your life to follow Jesus. You're not really preparing your character for marriage of the right man, so why should God send the right man yet? You're not ready for him if he showed up. You know, it's like, prayer is overrated. I've been praying and I still don't have a job. Well, how many have you applied for? Oh, 1 in the last month. You have to pray, but also position yourself. You have to get in the position for the prayers to be answered sometimes. And sometimes it's like God's saying, I want to answer your prayer. I've heard your prayer 20 times, but you're not doing any of the things that I've clearly said you should do for me to answer that prayer. Sometimes there needs to be a level of obedience there. And so he prays, and then notice he gets in position here. Okay, he's at the well. Where does he go to find the right woman for Isaac? He goes to the well. And if you study the well, you'll know that the well was a place of commerce. It was a place of industry. It's where the responsible people were going to pull out the water. And not only that, but they were doing it with a servant's heart, because this was a hard job to carry that water on your shoulder back to your people or your family or whatever. And so these women all had this servant's heart. And that's where he knew to go, because that's where he was going to find that. And it reminds me of my roommate in college. And he was kind of in this situation. He was saying, man, Jarrod, I'm praying every day that I meet my future wife, I said, that's great, man. Don't you think you should leave the dorm room once in a while? He just wasn't doing anything. I'm just waiting on God to send my wife. I'm just praying. It's I think, first of all, you should take a shower every day. That would also help me. And then, secondly, I think that you should place yourself in a place, what kind of wife do you want to meet? And he explained it to me, and I said, so you go to that church, right, down the street? Do they have a young adult group or a small group that you can plug into? Maybe you have to put yourself in a place where some of the women of God are hanging out, and then maybe you'll meet one. And the next week, it was such a cool thing. The point, though, is you have to be willing to sometimes position yourself for God to come through in that way. He went to the right place at the right time, and so then they came out. And again, he's looking for somebody with the heart of a servant. That's why he's there. And this goes for men and women. Those of you that aren't married to somebody yet, marry somebody with the heart of a servant, because that's the call of the Christian. It's what we're called to, both men and women. And so you need to marry somebody with the heart of a servant if you want that to be super blessed. And so he's saying, God, give me the sign. And what the sign is going to be is that she would be super hot, right? That's the sign. No, that's not what he said. That's not what he said. And hey, appearance is good. You go for someone that you find attractive. It even says here in verse 16, the girl was very beautiful. So that's part of this. Okay, it's not that that's not important. It's just that it's not the priority. It's not the most important thing. Okay, there's other things that are so much more important. It's don't make a list of the things you're looking for in a future husband, and the best you can think of to qualify him is I want him to have hair and be really kind. That's not enough. You have to have a longer list than that. I said this last week, but it's oh, he's really cute and he makes me laugh. And it's yeah, you're going to be laughing when 5 years down the road you find out his values are totally opposite of yours because you weren't paying attention. And I know that's hard to hear, but it's important to say to those who are not yet married. All right, verse 15. This part might frustrate you. It frustrates me, but I want to explain it. It says, before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with the jar on her shoulder. He didn't even say amen and God answered the prayer. How many of us get to have that? Is that even legal for God to do? Before you've even gotten the whole words of the prayer out of your mouth and he already brings you the answer. I don't feel like he hardly ever does that. That would be nice. Boom, here comes Rebekah carrying a jar, looking beautiful. It says everything's working out. Because you hear these stories, especially a lot of young people, they hear these stories. Yeah, I met my future spouse and we were 12 and everything was wonderful. And we started dating at 16. We were married by 19 and look, everything's great. And it works out that way sometimes. That's not a bad thing. It's a great thing. But I don't think that's the status quo, especially in our current time. And, it's so why don't you answer my prayers like that, God? And so let's think about this. You got to think about the Bible. You got to process this. So at this point, Isaac, does he know anything about Rebekah? No, he's 500 miles away. He might not even know his daddy sent this guy to go find him a wife. He's just going about his business. For all we know, he didn't even know that. 40 years old, back home, and we're going to see the end of the story in just a few minutes. But at the same time that he was over 500 miles away, God is working on his behalf. And that's the part I want to throw out there. We think sometimes that if we don't see a solution happening to the problem right in front of us, that God's not working. If the prayer's not answered within a certain amount of time, God must not be working on my behalf. If it doesn't happen exactly the way I think it should happen, well, God must not be working in it. And that's a dangerous place to go. I'm not saying it's easy to do this. It's hard. This is way easier said than done. But we have to, number 3, get to the point where we trust God even when we don't see where it's going. And that's difficult to do. You can actually find the right one and make them the wrong one because you're not ready to be the right one yet. I've seen that happen a lot too. You have to trust God's timing on these things. And again, easier said, harder to live out. So verse 15, before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother Nahor. The woman was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had ever slept with her. I'm going to say something that's really unpopular in our culture, but God said it first, so I'm going to repeat it. Notice here, and this is all throughout the scriptures, beauty and virginity are listed side by side. And so what you need to understand about that is purity is beautiful. And there's all these voices right now in our culture telling you the opposite. But purity is beautiful. And now I'm also not going to be one of those pastors that just drops that there and says, now walk out of here feeling all guilty. Because here's the thing. You say, well, I'm not pure. Yeah, but you can be from this day forward. You can be from this day forward, and it's beautiful. Okay? So it says that about her. Verse 16, she went down to the spring, she filled her jar, and came up again. The servant hurried to meet her and said, please give me a little water from your jar. Here's the test. Drink, my lord, she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. After she had given him a drink, she said, I'll draw water for your camels too, until they've had enough to drink. By the way, there's at least 10 camels. Every camel in this situation would drink about 40 gallons of water. This woman was going above and beyond. She had a servant's heart. She was exceptional in this area. And I would pause there and say, for the single people in the room, this is an important thing to understand. Do you want to marry somebody who just barely gets by with the things of God? Or do you want to marry somebody who's deeply hungry for the things of God? Do you want to marry somebody who acknowledges Jesus as their king, or somebody who lives like Jesus is their king? Just dropping that. Again, that's not for the married people. You're in your land. And that's for the single people because you still have that choice. Now, here's the other thing. I'm not telling you to put a standard on somebody else that you're not willing to put on yourself either. Okay? I can't tell you how many people I've run into, and it's like, I want a man of God that is just like this, or I want a woman of God that's just like this, and it's like, don't you think you should get to that place before you ask for that? Because again, you might meet the right person, and you're not the right person to meet that person yet. So you got to focus on yourself in that way. I think that's important. And so this is what I am telling you, and this is one of the greatest pieces of wisdom that was ever shared with my wife and I before we met. And that's a whole other story. I might tell it one of these weeks. When it comes to the things of God, do not settle. Do not settle. So she's watering all this man's camels. Verse 20, it says, she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, ran back to the well to draw more water, and drew enough for all his camels. And now this part matters. Without saying a word, the man watched her closely to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. That might be one of the most important relationship principles for dating people that I've ever read. Some of us, when we're dating, before we're married, the best advice you can have is shut up, step back, and pay attention. And that's what he's doing. Watching, observing. Because we get into this thing when we're dating, oh, I love you so much, I love you so much. And we forget to step back and look at it with an unbiased view sometimes. And so then what happens is you just fall right away with no true understanding of who the person really is at their core. And that is such an important thing to realize before getting married. I think Benjamin Franklin said this quote. I've been saying it for a while, but I think that's who originally said it. He said, before marriage, keep both eyes open. After marriage, keep both eyes closed. And I think that's good advice. But the problem is we do it the opposite way most of the time. We keep both eyes closed when we're dating, and then after marriage, our eyes open, and it's like, whoa. We do it the opposite way. We see all the flaws after marriage. We see all the things that, that's going to be hard to work through after marriage because we didn't open our eyes before we pulled the trigger on the marriage. And you could say it this way. What you already know and fully understand about a person is what gets you to the altar, right? Because, hey, I love them enough to get to this place. It's the things you learn after you've been to the altar. That's what the vows are for. in sickness and in health. You don't know if that's coming or not, for richer or poorer. Right? We could go through the whole list. Oh, I didn't know this was going to happen in my marriage. I didn't know this is how it was going to be. I didn't know this about this individual. That's what the vows are for. But that's an encouragement to people that are not yet married. Open your eyes now, not later, and pay attention to somebody's character. So he's watching. Is this the one? Is this the one? He's not jumping the gun. He's stepping back. He's trusting God. Verse 22, when the camels had finished drinking, the man took out a gold nose ring weighing a beka and 2 gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels. And she said to them, "Oh, are those Gucci?" Then he asked, "Whose daughter are you? Please tell me, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" She answered him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, born to Nahor. We got plenty of straw and fodder, as well as room for you to spend the night." So watch how God is at the center of this relationship from the beginning, okay? Then the man bowed down and worshiped the Lord. See, he's at the center of their relationship, right here, where God's not part of their relationship, he's the center of he's not a side note to their relationship that they sometimes go after. He's the center of the relationship. He's not a sideshow, he's the main event. And so, verse 27, he's praising God. He says, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the journey to the house of my master's relatives." And you want to be able to say that in your relationships. God has led me here. God was part of this story. God has led me to this place. He's led me on this journey. So then I'm going to skip over this whole next part because we need to be done in just a few minutes. And I'm going to go all the way to verse 49. You can go back and read that section I'm skipping by yourself, but basically what happens is, "Oh, I found you. Yes, you found me." So then they go into the father's house, and the mother's there, and they're telling the parents about the story. God did this, and God did that, and God led us here, and oh, let me tell you what he told me about Abraham and the son Isaac, and how God's got this plan he's going to fulfill, and I get to now be a part of that because I've been chosen to marry him and all this stuff. And so it's very exciting. And so they tell their story. And guys, that's what you want. No matter what relationship situation you find yourself in, mark my words, you don't want a Hollywood story, you want a God story. You want a story that God's involved in. God has to be involved in that story. Those Hollywood stories are phony. That's not how real life works. And so then at the end, right before the servant leaves and brings Rebekah back to Isaac, verse 49, he says, "If you will show kindness and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, so I may know which way to turn." Laban and Bethuel answered, "This is from the Lord. We can say nothing to you one way or another." We see God all over this, they're saying. "Here is Rebekah. Take her and go, and let her become the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed." And then they try to ask if they can have her for 10 more days, because it's hard for parents to let go, right? And you can read that on your own time. But then we're going to jump to verse 60. Right before they send her away, it says they blessed Rebekah. Parents, bless your children. I can't emphasize this enough. Bless your children. Every dad in here, you need to bless your daughter so good that she doesn't need another boy to tell her how beautiful she is because you've been telling her that her entire life. You need to speak so much life, parents, into your son that he knows who he was created to be before he reaches adulthood. It's going to help in relationships. Bless your family. And this is what he says, "Our sister, may you increase to thousands upon thousands. May your offspring possess the cities of their enemies." And then Rebekah and her attendants got ready and mounted the camels and went back with the man. So the servant took Rebekah and left. The band's going to come back up now. We're closing. Let me just read you the end of the story. Verse 62, Isaac had come from Beer Lahai Roi, for he was living in the Negev. He went out to the field one evening to meditate, and as he looked up, he saw camels approaching. This is the first time he meets his future bride. Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac. She got down from her camel and asked the servant, "Who is that man in the field coming to meet us?" "He is my master," the servant answered. So she took her veil, said yes to the dress, and covered herself. And the veil in case you don't know the symbolism, it was a sign of virtue and purity. And then here's the storybook ending. Then the servant told Isaac all he had done and how God had been involved. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, who had died 3 years ago, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. What a crazy story. What a big story. But as big as that story sounds, it's just a small story in the scope of the bigger story that it's a part of, where God is carrying out his purpose and his plans. And so I want to say one last thing before I end. For any of you that might be having difficulty in your story right now, especially in the area of relationships, if things are broken, if things are shattered, if you don't know how the pieces are going to be put back together, if you feel like you're in the middle of the 450-mile-long journey and you don't see an end in sight, whatever it might be, I just want to remind you that your story is part of a bigger story, and it's God's story. God keeps his promises. He takes care of his children. He has a plan for every single one of you. And even when it seems unredeemable, I want to remind you that your story is part of a bigger story that God is writing, and it is a gospel story. And he's going to use all of this one day, if you'll let him, to paint a beautiful picture, to sing a new song that maybe you didn't see as possible when you were in the middle of that journey. And I believe that God is using your story to write a greater story in which he's the hero and he receives all the glory, because that's where it will all go in the end. And he's writing a story through your life, and you can believe that. And what's interesting to me is that at the very end of all this, we read that Isaac, he was just out in the field meditating, just doing his thing, doing what God had told him to do, and then God handles the next part. Because you know what? Here's what I've come to conclude after going through lots of relationship struggles with hundreds of people over the years in this role. People here at Rise, people outside the church. After seeing all the different stories that I've seen, this is what I know for sure. True security in your relationship. The peace this describes that passes all understanding. That unspeakable joy. True fulfillment. True wholeness out of a place of brokenness. It's not really found in finding the right person. It's found in being the person that God has called you to be. It starts with you. It starts with understanding who you are in him and that you are his child. And if you'll be the person God has called you to be, Isaac, God will do everything that he has promised to do in your life. So God, I pray this morning that no matter what people in this room or those watching at home might be going through, God, I realize in a group this size, there's going to be lots of different relationship things going on. And God, I don't want to for a second minimize their pain or make it sound like there's an easy solution. But God, I do want to point them to you, the restorer of all things. So God, I pray that every person in this room would walk out of here today with your principles to apply in their relationships. God, that first they would pray, but that they wouldn't just pray, but then they would position themselves where you want them to be. And your word makes that pretty clear in specific areas. And then the hardest part, God, that they would have the strength, the courage to trust you, even when they're walking through a seemingly impossible situation. To trust that you're going to work it out, to trust that you are the master at restoring that which is broken. God, for those in the room who are not yet married, I pray that they would take those words to heart. Do not settle. That it's okay to be specific, that it's okay to have a list of what you're looking for in a future spouse. And it's okay not to settle for the first person that comes along and instead wait for your best for them. God, for any marriages in the room that are struggling or that are in a difficult spot, I pray that they would seek help if they need it, that they would understand and know that we are a safe place to receive that help, and we have people ready to come alongside them and support them in whatever way that looks like. And God, would you do what only you can do? Would you give them a story like I've seen hundreds of times in this church, where even when it seemed like there was no hope and things were broken, years later we see such a beautiful picture of what you've put back together. Would you guide us and give us wisdom in our relationships? And I pray these things in the mighty name of Jesus.